The first thing I saw was my daughter's hand hanging over the side of a guest room bed, her wedding ring still on her finger, her knuckles bruised her body too still. For one terrible second, I was not a father. I was a soldier again, standing in a place where something unforgivable had happened, forcing myself not to react before I understood the room. Behind me, her mother-in-law was shouting, "You had no right to come in here." I looked at my daughter's pale face, then at her husband standing by the dresser with fear in his eyes and guilt all over his mouth. And I said very quietly, "You should have let her leave." But that was not where the night began. It began at 2:07 in the morning when my phone rang on the nightstand beside my bed. At my age, a phone call after midnight never feels ordinary. I am 68 years old, retired Army widowed 5 years, and I have learned that life saves its worst news for the hours when the house is dark. I reached for the phone with one hand and my glasses with the other. The screen said Emily. "My daughter," I answered before the second ring finished. "Honey." For a moment, all I heard was breathing, fast, broken, like someone trying not to cry too loudly. Then her voice came through barely above a whisper. "Dad, please come get me." I sat straight up. "Emily, where are you?" "At Kyle's parents' house." Her husband's parents lived 22 minutes away in a quiet neighborhood outside Springfield, Missouri. Nice lawns, brick mailboxes, American flags on porches. The kind of street where people notice if your trash cans stay out too long, but somehow miss what happens behind closed doors. "What happened?" I asked. There was a sound in the background, a door, a voice. Then Emily whispered, "Please hurry." The line went dead. I called back, nothing. I called again, straight to voicemail. By the time I pulled on my jeans and grabbed my truck keys, my hands were steady. That may sound strange, but the Army taught me something. Grief never could panic, waste time. You can break down later, in the moment you move. Still, as I drove through the dark streets, every mile brought back something I had tried too hard to excuse. Emily missing Sunday dinner because Kyle said she was tired. Emily wearing long sleeves in August. Emily laughing too quickly when I asked if she was happy. "She's just adjusting, Dad," I used to tell myself. Marriage has growing pains. But deep down I knew. A father knows the difference between privacy and fear. Kyle had always been polite in the way weak men are polite when other men are watching. "Yes, sir." "No, sir." "Let me get that for you, Jack." But when he looked at Emily, there was something behind his eyes I never liked. Not anger exactly. Ownership. His mother, Margaret, was worse. She was the kind of woman who could insult you with a casserole in her hands and a Bible verse on her lips. She called Emily sensitive. She called our family simple. Once at Thanksgiving, she told my daughter, "In our family, wives don't run home every time they feel uncomfortable." Emily had lowered her eyes. I should have heard that sentence louder. When I turned onto their street, most houses were dark. Kyle's parents' place had the porch light on, but every curtain was closed. My headlights swept across Margaret's white SUV in the driveway, and Kyle's truck parked crooked near the garage. I left my truck running. Margaret opened the front door before I reached it like she had been waiting. She wore a robe tied tight at the waist hair, fixed well enough to tell me she had not just woken up. "Jack," she said, blocking the doorway with her body, "this is not a good time." My daughter called me. "She's upset." "I want to see her." Margaret's mouth tightened. She and Kyle had a disagreement. "It is being handled." "Move." Her eyes sharpened. "You do not come into my house and give orders." From somewhere inside I heard something. Not words, a small sound, a woman's broken breath. "Emily." I stepped forward. Margaret put one hand against the doorframe and said cold as winter, "She's not going anywhere." That was the moment something old woke up in me. Not rage. Rage makes noise. This was colder than rage. I looked at her hand on the doorframe and said, "Take your hand down." She didn't. So I walked right past her. She shouted behind me, but I kept moving. Down the hall, past family portraits, past a table with a cross and a bowl of wrapped peppermints, past all that polished respectability hiding rot underneath. The guest room door was partly closed. I pushed it open, and there she was, my little girl. 36 years old, married, grown, but still the child who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. Emily lay on the bed with one cheek swollen, her lips split, and dark marks along her arms. Her phone was in pieces on the carpet. Kyle stood near the dresser, pale and sweating. "Jack," he said, raising both hands, "this is not what it looks like." I took out my phone and dialed 911. Then I looked him straight in the eye. "You should have let her leave." The flashing red and blue lights reached the house before the ambulance did. I stood beside Emily's bed without saying another word. Kyle shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as though he couldn't decide whether to explain himself or run. Margaret followed me into the room, her voice rising with every step. "You had no business barging into my home," she snapped. "This is trespassing." I never took my eyes off my daughter. "Emily," I said, gently kneeling beside her. "Honey, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. She opened them just enough to recognize my face. "Dad," her voice cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I'm sorry." That sentence hit me harder than anything else that night. Not "help me." Not "I'm hurt." She apologized. Victims often do. I had seen it before in another lifetime, though, under different circumstances. People who have been controlled long enough begin believing every disaster is somehow their fault. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I told her. She tried to sit up but winced immediately. Kyle stepped forward. "She fainted," he said quickly. "She got emotional. Nobody hurt her." I finally looked at him. "You expect me to believe she accidentally bruised both arms, split her lip, and smashed her own phone?" It wasn't like, "Don't." One word. Quiet. Firm. He stopped talking. The first sheriff's deputy arrived less than 3 minutes later, followed almost immediately by paramedics. The deputy was a man in his early 40s named Deputy Collins. Calm face. Steady voice. The kind of officer who had seen enough family disputes to know that the loudest person was rarely the most truthful. Margaret reached him before anyone else. "Officer," she said dramatically, "this man forced his way into our house. He's frightening everyone." Collins glanced at me. "Sir." Before I answered, one of the paramedics spoke from beside Emily. "She needs to be evaluated. Possible concussion." Everything in the room paused. Medical facts have a way of cutting through arguments. As they checked Emily's pupils and blood pressure, I noticed something almost nobody else seemed to notice. The room itself. The Army teaches observation before reaction. A broken lamp lay beside the dresser. One drawer had been pulled halfway out. Emily's purse sat open on the floor with its contents scattered. Near the trash can was a towel with what looked like dried blood. None of it matched Margaret's story about an emotional episode. Deputy Collins began separating everyone. He asked me to wait in the hallway. Kyle stayed in the living room. Margaret remained in the kitchen, complaining loudly enough for the entire house to hear. "This family has done nothing but love that girl." I almost laughed. Love doesn't take someone's phone. Love doesn't block doors. Love doesn't leave bruises. While Collins interviewed Kyle, another deputy photographed the room. I watched silently. Margaret kept pacing. Every few minutes, she looked toward Emily's bedroom door almost nervously. Not worried. Watching. As though she hoped something wouldn't be discovered. That bothered me. Years ago overseas, I'd learned something about guilty people. Innocent people worry about people. Guilty people worry about evidence. About 20 minutes later, the paramedics wheeled Emily toward the ambulance. She reached for my hand. "I don't want to stay here." "You're not staying," I said. "You're coming home with me." Margaret immediately interrupted. "She lives with her husband." Emily flinched. I answered before my daughter could. "She decides where she lives." For the first time that night, Emily looked directly at Margaret. She didn't say anything. She simply squeezed my hand tighter. That tiny movement told me more than an hour of conversation ever could. At the hospital, they admitted Emily for observation. The emergency physician confirmed a concussion dehydration bruising consistent with restraint and several older bruises in different stages of healing. Different stages. That phrase stayed with me. It meant this hadn't happened once. It had happened before. When the nurse finally left us alone, Emily stared at the ceiling for a long time. "I should have called you sooner." "You called when you could." I kept thinking things would get better. I nodded. "Tell me." She took several slow breaths. "Kyle wasn't always like this." That sentence sounded familiar too. I've heard widows say it. Parents of addicts say it. People trying to hold on to memories instead of reality say it. "He started letting his mother make every decision," Emily continued. "Money, holidays, where we lived, even who I spent time with." I stayed quiet. "She said I wasn't responsible enough to manage our finances." Emily swallowed hard. "Last month, my grandmother's estate finally settled." I frowned. "Your inheritance." She nodded. "It wasn't millions, just enough to pay off our mortgage and save for retirement." How much did they know? They knew everything. She closed her eyes. "Margaret wanted me to transfer it into a joint investment account her financial advisor controlled." "And you refused?" "Yes." "What happened tonight?" Emily's fingers trembled. "They invited us over for dinner." She paused. "When I said I wouldn't sign the paperwork?" Margaret locked the front door. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Kyle took my phone. She looked away. "They said nobody was leaving until I came to my senses." Silence settled between us. Finally, she whispered, "I found an old phone in the guest room nightstand. The one you called me with." She nodded. "I only had enough battery for one call." Then she looked at me with tears filling her eyes. "I knew you'd come." I reached over and held her hand. "I'll always come," she cried quietly. Not because she was afraid anymore, because she finally believed she wasn't alone. An hour later, while the nurses changed her room, a deputy walked in carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside were the broken pieces of Emily's smashed phone. "We recovered the memory card," he said. "The technicians think it may still contain audio recorded before the phone was destroyed." I looked at the shattered device. For the first time since that terrible night began, I believed the truth had found its own witness. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried about what would happen next, because I kept replaying one sentence in my head. "They said nobody was leaving until I came to her senses." Those weren't the words of a heated family argument. Those were the words of people who believed they had the right to control another adult. By sunrise, Emily was still asleep in her hospital room. The swelling around her left eye had become more noticeable, and fresh bruises had appeared beneath the fluorescent lights. Injuries always reveal themselves more honestly the morning after. I walked quietly to the cafeteria and came back with 2 cups of coffee, forgetting halfway back that Emily never drank coffee. She preferred hot chocolate, even at 36. That small memory nearly broke me. When she finally woke, she looked embarrassed more than anything else. "Dad, you should go home and rest." I smiled. "I've spent colder nights sleeping in army tents." She managed the smallest laugh. It was the first genuine sound I'd heard from her since that phone call. A social worker stopped by later that morning. She introduced herself as Karen and explained that the hospital routinely spoke with patients when injuries suggested possible domestic violence or coercive control. Emily looked nervous. Karen noticed immediately. "You don't have to make any decisions today," she said gently. "Our job isn't to pressure you. It's to make sure you understand your options." That sentence mattered. Nobody had been giving Emily options for a very long time. After Karen left, Emily stared out the window. I didn't even realize how small my world had become. "What do you mean?" She took a long breath. "I stopped seeing my friends because Kyle said they were bad influences." She counted softly on her fingers. "I stopped volunteering at church because Margaret said wives should spend weekends with family." Another finger. "I stopped visiting you unless Kyle came too." Then another. "I stopped buying clothes without asking first because they said I wasn't responsible with money." She looked at me. "I thought I was compromising." I shook my head. "No. You were disappearing." Those words hung between us. She didn't argue, because she knew they were true. That afternoon, Detective Alan Brooks from the sheriff's office came to interview Emily. When he introduced himself, I recognized him immediately. 25 years earlier, he'd been a young military police officer, attached to the same installation where I served my final assignment before retirement. He smiled. "Jack Miller." I stood. "Alan Brooks." We shook hands warmly. "I heard your name before I walked in," he admitted. "Didn't expect it to be you." Life has strange ways of reconnecting people. After Emily finished giving her statement, Alan asked if he could speak with me privately. We stepped into the hallway. "Jack," he said quietly, "this doesn't look like a simple domestic dispute." "I know. The smashed phone concerns me. So does the locked door." He nodded. "And the inheritance." That caught my attention. "You already know. Kyle mentioned it." "What did he say?" Alan opened his notebook. "He claims Emily became irrational after inheriting money." I almost laughed. "Convenient." "Very." Alan leaned against the wall. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has Kyle's family ever behaved this way before?" "I don't know, but my instincts say yes." He studied me for a moment. "I trust instincts. I learned from good investigators." He smiled. "I'll start digging." When Alan left, I realized something. For the first time since that awful night, I wasn't carrying the burden alone. The system was finally paying attention. 2 days later, Emily was discharged. I brought her home, not to some grand house, just the same little ranch home where she'd grown up. The swing on the front porch still creaked. Her mother's flower garden still bloomed along the walkway. Her old bedroom had become my reading room after she married, but within an hour, I'd moved the books back into the hallway. "It still smells the same," she whispered. "Your mother would have liked that." She smiled sadly. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table with folders spread everywhere. Hospital records, photographs, insurance forms, bank statements, screenshots from old emails. One document caught my eye. A draft investment agreement. Margaret's financial advisor had prepared paperwork transferring nearly all of Emily's inheritance into a family-managed investment account, requiring multiple signatures for withdrawals. Emily pointed at one paragraph. I didn't understand all the legal language. You understood enough not to sign. She nodded. I kept telling them I wanted my own lawyer. And they said hiring my own lawyer meant I didn't trust family. I sighed. Abusers often wrap control inside words like family, love, loyalty, and respect. Emily looked ashamed again. I almost believed them. I reached across the table. Smart people get manipulated every day. They know exactly which emotions to use. The next morning, my phone rang. Kyle. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, another call. Then another. Finally, I listened. His voice sounded exhausted. Jack, please, tell Emily I'm sorry. A pause. I never wanted things to go this far. Another pause. My mom was just trying to help. I deleted nothing. Instead, I saved every voicemail. By evening, Margaret started calling. Her message sounded completely different. You've destroyed this family. Another message followed. If Emily doesn't come home immediately, she'll regret it. Another. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I saved those too. Then I bought an external hard drive. Every voicemail, every text, every email, every document. Years in the Army had taught me something simple. Hope is not a strategy. Evidence is. 3 days later, Alan called. Jack? Yeah, I found something. What is it? There was another woman. I felt my stomach tighten. Another affair? No. He paused. Another fiancé? My grip tightened on the phone. Kyle was engaged once before Emily. I've never heard that. Most people haven't. Alan's voice became quieter. The engagement ended suddenly. Why? That's exactly what I'm trying to find out. I looked toward the living room where Emily sat quietly reading. Something told me our family wasn't discovering a single terrible night. We were uncovering a pattern. And patterns don't disappear until someone finally refuses to look away. The more I learned about Margaret, the less exceptional that terrible night seemed. That was the most disturbing part. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. Alan called me the following afternoon. I found Laura. For a moment, I didn't answer. The former fiancé, yes. Will she talk? A brief silence. She said she'd never planned to. 2 days later, Alan arranged for us to meet Laura at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where retirees gathered every morning and everyone knew the waitress by name. Laura was in her early 40s now. She looked composed, successful even, but there was a caution in her eyes that reminded me of Emily after she left the hospital. She shook my hand. I've wanted to forget that family for 15 years. Emily sat quietly beside me. You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to, she said. Laura smiled sadly. That's exactly what nobody said to me back then. She wrapped both hands around her coffee before speaking. Kyle wasn't the problem at first. Emily looked surprised. He was kind when we dated. What changed? His mother. Laura let out a slow breath. Margaret decided everything. Where they lived, what church they attended, how money was spent, which friends were acceptable, even how holidays were celebrated. It happened so gradually, Laura continued. Every time I pushed back, Kyle would say, she's just trying to help us. Emily lowered her eyes. I've heard those exact words. Laura nodded. I finally inherited my grandmother's cabin. Emily looked at me. Our eyes met. The pattern. It wasn't worth a fortune, Laura said, but Margaret wanted me to transfer ownership into a family trust. And when you refused, I asked. Laura's face hardened. They told everyone at church I was unstable. Emily inhaled sharply. Laura continued. Kyle accused me of becoming emotionally abusive. What happened? I left. She looked directly at Emily. And for years I wondered whether I had overreacted. Emily reached across the table and gently took Laura's hand. You didn't. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with finally meeting someone who lived the same nightmare. Before we left, Laura turned to me. If this goes to court, it will. I'll testify. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Laura smiled. I'm not doing it for revenge. She glanced toward the window. I'm doing it so she doesn't spend 15 years wondering whether it was her fault. A week later, Kyle officially filed his response. His attorney claimed Emily had become emotionally unstable after receiving her inheritance. He accused her of stealing financial records from the house. He even claimed she assaulted Margaret before leaving. Emily stared at the papers with trembling hands. I never touched her. I know. They're making me sound crazy. I sat beside her. They're trying to make the judge believe that before they ever have to prove anything. She buried her face in her hands. What if people believe them? I answered with something I'd learned decades earlier. The truth doesn't always speak first, but it usually speaks last. Our attorney, Rebecca Sullivan, joined us later that afternoon. She had practiced family law for nearly 30 years and had seen every form of manipulation imaginable. After reviewing the evidence, she looked up. They made one mistake. What? They assumed you wouldn't document anything. She organized everything into neat folders. Hospital photographs, medical reports, phone records, financial documents, threatening voicemails. Then she held up the small memory card recovered from Emily's broken phone. And this, she smiled for the first time, may become the most important witness in the courtroom. The forensic technicians had recovered nearly 6 minutes of audio. Rebecca played the cleaned recording. At first there was muffled movement. Kyle saying, "Emily, stop making this harder." Emily crying. Then Margaret's unmistakable voice. "You sign tonight?" A pause. "Or you're not leaving this house." The room fell completely silent. Emily covered her mouth. Rebecca stopped the recording. "That's unlawful restraint." I looked at my daughter. For the first time since that awful night, I saw relief instead of fear. Not because everything was over, because she finally realized she wasn't asking people to simply believe her anymore. The truth had spoken for itself. The hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Margaret entered the courthouse dressed elegantly, carrying her Bible. Several members of her church sat behind her. Kyle wore a navy suit and kept his eyes lowered. If I hadn't known better, I might have mistaken him for the victim. Emily squeezed my arm. "I'm scared." "I know. So am I." She looked surprised. "You are." I nodded. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding fear doesn't get the final vote. When our case was called, everyone stood. Margaret glanced at me with quiet confidence. She still believed appearances would save her. She had no idea what was about to happen when that recording echoed through the courtroom. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear the old ceiling fan turning above us. Rebecca stood, nodded to the judge, and asked permission to play the recovered recording. Margaret's attorney objected. The recording was made without my client's knowledge. Rebecca remained calm. "The recording was recovered from my client's own phone, Your Honor. It documents statements made while she was being unlawfully prevented from leaving." The judge adjusted his glasses. "I'll allow it." The speaker crackled. At first there was only shuffling a chair scraping across the floor and Emily's frightened voice asking for her phone back. Then Kyle spoke. "Emily, stop making this harder." A few seconds later came the sentence that changed everything. Margaret's voice was unmistakable. "You sign tonight, or you're not leaving this house." No one moved. Even Margaret's attorney slowly lowered his pen. Rebecca didn't rush. She let the silence do its work. Then she submitted the hospital records, documenting Emily's concussion photographs of the bruises on her arms, the broken phone, and the threatening voicemail Margaret had left after Emily came home. One by one, the pieces fit together. Not perfectly. Truth rarely arrives perfectly. But honestly, Laura testified next. She described nearly the same pattern from 15 years earlier. Control, isolation, financial pressure, public humiliation. When Rebecca asked whether anyone had physically stopped her from leaving, Laura answered quietly. "No." She paused. "They didn't have to." The courtroom understood exactly what she meant. Margaret's attorney tried to paint Laura as a bitter former fiancé. Laura simply smiled. "I've been happily married for 12 years. She glanced toward Emily. "I came because I couldn't live with myself if another woman believed she was the only one." Then it was Emily's turn. I watched my daughter walk to the witness stand. Her hands trembled. Her voice did not. "I love my husband." She looked toward Kyle. "I kept believing that if I tried harder, things would go back to the way they were." Kyle finally looked up. Tears filled his eyes. "I thought protecting my marriage meant keeping my mother happy." Emily shook her head gently. "No, it meant protecting your wife." Kyle lowered his head again. For the first time since I'd known him, he stopped making excuses. When the judge asked whether he wished to say anything further, Kyle stood slowly. He didn't look at me. He looked at Emily. "I'm sorry. I let my mother make decisions I should have made. I kept telling myself it wasn't abuse because I never wanted to believe my own family could do something like this." He swallowed hard. "I failed you." Margaret immediately interrupted. "Kyle, don't say another word." He turned toward her. "No, Mom." It was the first time anyone had ever heard him tell her no. "I should have done that years ago." Margaret's composure finally cracked. She blamed Emily, then Laura, then me, then even her own son. By the time she stopped talking, the courtroom had learned far more from her anger than any witness could have explained. The judge issued a protective order for Emily, referred the financial documents for further investigation, and made it clear that attempts to coerce someone into signing legal papers under confinement would not be treated lightly. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Emily declined every interview. So did I. Justice didn't need a microphone. It only needed the truth. Months passed. Emily moved into a small apartment 10 minutes from my house. She started seeing a counselor every week. Little by little, she became herself again. Not the same woman she had been before. A stronger one. One Saturday afternoon, she came over carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. "I figured you'd finally remember I don't drink coffee," she teased. I laughed harder than I had in months. Kyle eventually wrote her a letter, not asking her to come back, not asking for another chance, simply accepting responsibility for his choices and telling her he had entered counseling. Emily read the letter once. Then she placed it in a drawer. "I forgive him," she told me, "but forgiveness doesn't require another marriage." I couldn't have said it better myself. Margaret never apologized. Perhaps she never will. Some people spend so many years controlling others that they no longer recognize the damage they've done. That burden belongs to them, not to the people who survived them. One evening, Emily and I sat on my front porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was a little girl. "You know," she said softly, "when I called you that night, I wasn't sure you'd make it in time." I smiled. "I would have driven through a hurricane." She laughed. "I know that now." Then she asked the question I'd been thinking about ever since that terrible night. "When you walked past Margaret, what did you mean when you said the soldier and you woke up?" I looked across the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the part that knew how to fight. She waited. It was the part that knew how to stay calm when everyone else was panicking. The part that knew innocent people need someone who doesn't lose their head. She squeezed my hand. "I think Mom would have been proud." I hope so. If this story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. When someone you love suddenly grows quiet, pulls away, or says, "Everything's fine," don't always accept those words at face value. Ask again. Listen longer. Let them know they can come home without shame. Sometimes one phone call can save a life. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is answer it. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who may need to hear it, please consider sharing it. And if you enjoy stories about family courage and quiet justice, I'd be honored if you joined us for the next one.